Hello and welcome to our video, 5 questions for a sanctions lawyer. I'm Kara Franstead from KMH Financial Services, and joining us today is Tyler Grove, who is a specialist on sanctions, export control, and foreign investment review. I have linked Tyler's bio in our video description if you want to learn more about what he does. And without further ado, let's jump right in, Tyler. A lot of critics are saying that sanctions have never worked. Why is that?
Yeah, well, thanks, Karen. Thanks for having me on. So I'm not sure it's fair to say that sanctions have never worked. It's important to recognize that they're one tool in the foreign policy toolbox. But I do think that one reason that one might have that perception could be that sanctions tend to escalate until either the target of the sanctions changes their behavior or the sanctions themselves become entrenched for years, possibly decades. Some of the sanctions programs, for example, that I guess one might consider to be quote unquote failures in the sense that they have not yet achieved their ultimate goals would be those targeting Cuba, Iran, Syria, North Korea that have been around for quite some years and are some of the most visible sanctions that the US has. You might also add in Crimea, which has been under sanctions since 2014, but that clearly has not deterred Russia from further aggression towards Ukraine. But sanctions programs, they're also, when they're successful, they tend to be removed once they've achieved their goal. And so I think the successful ones actually have somewhat less public visibility. And just some quick examples might be US sanctions targeting Taiwan in the 70s, which deterred that country from continuing its research on developing nuclear weapons. More recently, US sanctions that were targeting Sudan for terrorism-related activity. When that country made reforms, those were removed recently. And a few years ago, we threatened sanctions against Turkey when it looked like Turkey might align itself militarily with Russia. When Turkey backed away from that, we never actually took any sanctions action and removed even the executive order that was threatening that.
Wow, that's great information. I didn't realize there was something even that recent. That's great to know. So second question, do they have a chance of working in this situation, or anything in particular that you've seen from the existing sanctions that is working well?
Yeah, the one thing I think we've seen with Russia here that we really haven't seen before is just that these are very multilateral, and Russia also has a large import-dependent economy. So it's unlike, for example, North Korea, which is also multilateral, but it has a very isolated economy, or Iran or Cuba, which are unilateral sanctions only imposed by the US. And here, because Europe and other allied countries, which include Japan, South Korea, and other major economies, because they've imposed similar restrictions on Russia, and in some cases, restrictions that are even more stringent than what the US has done, especially the EU, Russia's ability to access external resources currently is very restricted. As I mentioned, this is in contrast to some of the unilateral sanctions that we have. I'll also note that our threatened extraterritorial secondary sanctions have also deterred some of our less friendly countries from aiding Russia, particularly China, at least thus far. And there's been some talk of Europe actually adopting similar secondary sanctions to those that we have for that exact reason as well. I think the other key area where the current Russia sanctions seem to be succeeding is in the reputational harm that is imposed on countries that continue to operate there, even if that's still legally permissible. And I do note that although it's very restricted and there's a ton of risk, Russia is not yet a comprehensively embargoed country, similar to some of the other ones we discussed, like Iran, Cuba, Syria. And there are ways to still compliantly do business there. But a number of private parties, most notably Yale University, have been keeping a running list of names of companies that continue to operate, basically to name and shame them and to encourage them to withdraw their operations. And I think that the success of that effort has surprised even US authorities.
Well, that's fascinating. I didn't know that Yale was keeping that list. I've seen some lists going around, but that's fascinating that they're keeping that updated. Our third question for you, how many rounds of sanctions do you expect the US to issue?
Yeah, it's a great question. Unfortunately, we can only really speculate at this point, and we're getting to the point where a significant number of restrictions have already been imposed. So I do anticipate that we'll continue to see some incremental sanctions so long as Russia continues its war, but I think their frequency will probably decline over time. But that being said, I think there are three general areas where we could see the US at least taking some future action. The first, considering reports of possible war crimes in Bucha and Mariupol, I think we could see some future humanitarian-based sanctions. And the biggest difference here is where a lot of what we call sanctions against Russia have been really export control focused, aimed at denying Russia access to products from the US or products made from US technology. Humanitarian-based sanctions would add, I think, additional parties to the most restrictive blacklist that we have, which is the specially designated nationals list. And that would, in effect, remove those parties entirely from the US financial system, from doing transactions with all US parties, and would impose the threat of secondary sanctions. Second, I think we could see some sanctions aimed at non-Russian parties. As I mentioned before, potentially China if they decide to start aiding Russia. These type of sanctions have been used only sparingly so far, but I do expect that additional actions may be coming if Russia further entrenches itself and can find that third-party support. And then third, kind of going the opposite direction, I actually think we might see potentially an easing of the current restrictions targeting the Russian aviation industry. Typically, US sanctions carve out civilian flights from the restrictions. We've seen this with Iran, with North Korea, but that hasn't been the case so far with Russia, and it's actually been somewhat draconian. And because the US generally has a policy interest of maintaining safe civilian transportation, and also has an interest in encouraging Russian citizens to move about the world and get news about the war that they might not be getting at home when they're subject to heavy censorship, I think we could see some general license authorizations for things like aircraft spare parts, and also to authorize Russian aircraft to fly abroad.
Oh, interesting. So you did, for our fourth question, you did sort of bring up already the EU countries, which ties into our fourth question. With such a global economy and Europe's dependency on Russia for energy consumption, can the EU countries really have an impact with their sanctions since they're so dependent?
Yeah, it's another great question. And the EU's dependency on Russian energy has been really a huge blind spot in the current effort to deter Russia. As a result of this dependency, the US and the EU have largely exempted energy-related transactions. And the major Russian energy producers, such as Gazprom, have been left off the most restrictive list, at least on the US side, in order to allow EU parties to continue to engage in those energy-related transactions. I do note that last week we've been starting to hear some reports that the EU is considering a potential ban on Russian origin oil. Again, we'd have to wait for those to actually come out officially to know if there's any carve-outs or to know what the scope of those restrictions might be. But assuming that it would be a broad restriction like the US has also imposed, it would remove a lot of the rationale for exempting these transactions. It would also, quite frankly, drastically reduce Russia's ability to sell its oil worldwide.
Right, right. And then finally, fifth question, how will these current sanctions affect economies like ours who are imposing these sanctions? As you may know, we're in the personal finance business, and everybody's really concerned about how this will affect our market in the future.
Yeah, so Russia has an economy centered on the export of natural resources, and there's not a ton of US investment there, or at least direct investment, like there would be with, for example, China or some other countries. And so I think where we will really feel the effects here will be more indirectly. So for example, the ban on the import of Russian origin oil that I mentioned has probably contributed significantly to some of the rising gas prices that we've all been feeling. And I think there could be some effect too on those companies that are continuing to operate in Russia, to the extent that they are suffering that reputational harm that could have an effect on things like share price, on their ability to maintain supplier contracts. A lot of suppliers have just stopped shipping to Russia, or to companies that there's a risk that those items could be taken to Russia. I think it'll potentially have a far bigger impact on Eastern Europe, where many countries like Germany and Poland are dependent on Russian oil and gas for the energy needs. But for the time being, I will say there appears to be some appetite by the EU to inflict harsh sanctions on Russia, even at the expense of some collateral damage to their economy.
That's fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Tyler, for being with us today. This was incredibly helpful and educational for us, and we wish you luck. I know this is a tough time for you in your business, and thanks again so much for being with us.
Thank you, Kara. It was a pleasure being here.